All right, welcome to lesson 13. Look at lesson 13. We're going to be looking at your outline a little bit today. The in-person class for Thursday and Friday will include a discussion of a couple different This I Believe essays that you will be hunting for on your own in class. So we're going to dive into it, and we will have a 15-minute writing portion, including that discussion. It'll probably run a little bit closer to 20 minutes into the live class. The literature will probably be about 8 minutes long, not necessarily get all the way to 10 minutes. And then we do have an informational lesson today, but there's no assignment. So we're going to talk a little bit about nonfiction, but we won't have an assignment attached to that lesson. All right, some things that have been due on the left side of the screen. Upcoming assignments that are due this Saturday are Chapter 4 in The Great Gatsby. That's the blue word questions that are aligned to the reading portion of the ACT. We're looking at character development and the characters and our main characters of Gatsby. And then we're also the outline for your This I Believe essay is also due this Saturday. We've been working on that for about a week and a half now, and those are coming in. We'll have some space to work on them also in class and during my office hour on Wednesday. Our learning targets for this week, and a link to the page that has all of the recorded assignment explanations. In literature, we're going to read the Chapter 4 in The Great Gatsby, answer some narrative and plot development questions. This means we can understand and follow the plot and character development in a grade level literature text. There's no new informational learning target today, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about bias and news as we're coming into the end of this election season. I think it's valuable information to have, especially if you're a senior and you're of voting age. For our writing learning target, we're going to write that outline, and it will allow us to begin pre-writing on our first A2C essay. This means you can complete the first step in the writing process for creating essays by synthesizing your experience and the rubric. And then that miscellaneous goal is still turning in old work. This 6 weeks grading period, I will take work over the weekends, even though the end of the grading period is tomorrow. It is Thursday, the 8th. I will take work this weekend if you can get it to me, and I will do my best to get it into Infinite Campus. In the future, I will not take late work on the last week of a grading period, simply because it usually means I'm swamped and I'm hustling a lot in those last 24 hours of the grade window, when really you should be hustling far before the last 24 hours of the grade window to turn stuff in. All right, our week structure is as follows. Monday, Tuesday, pre-recorded lesson and in-class lesson. Wednesday, we have office hours where you can come in and get assistance on anything that you have questions about. And then Thursday and Friday, I will have a posted lesson as well. And in class, we'll have discussions in workspace. All right, here's a set of mindfulness. Take a moment to vibe with this grass. Check out those grass fronds. They're probably not fronds. It's nice. Okay. So in class, this will be a little bit more busy than it will be in this recorded version. Your outline for your essay is due this Saturday, October the 10th, and you will also include a written anecdote or vignette, which is just a very, very short story, like 2 to 3 sentence story that supports your topic statement. And if you're confused about how to outline that essay, stay tuned for just a second. In the class on Thursday and Friday, we're going to be doing this live activity where I give you some space to find an essay that you want to listen to from a list. I'll give you 4 minutes to find it, 10 minutes to listen to it, and at the end of the 14 minutes, we'll all get back together and discuss what we heard the writer talk about, what they believed, and how they explained it. So we'll be doing that in class on Thursday and Friday, and that's kind of our in-class discussion slash work. What the assignment itself looks like is this. So to complete this assignment, you're writing a topic statement with 3 supporting statements. Your topic statement is your This I Believe statement. Your 3 supporting statements will become 3 paragraphs. And you're also going to be writing a short vignette or anecdote that supports the multi-part statement that you make at the beginning. If you want a longer explanation or walkthrough of this, go to the page that has all of my recorded explanations. The one that I have there is about a 15-minute explanation of this assignment with more detailed steps. All right, and also due this Saturday is the 10-question response to Chapter 4 in The Great Gatsby. You can find that guided reading by grabbing this link and going to Chapter 4. You can read it on your own on the slides, or you can read it with me as if we were in class. Your goal is to read that 4th chapter in Gatsby and then answer the 10 questions on the next slide. Or on the next slide. Just a quick reminder, those blue words in the chapters are aligned to ACT reading concepts like theme, authorial choice, character development, and literary devices. So whenever I pause and discuss those blue words, I'm talking to you about ACT level thought processes and concepts, and we're going to formalize them a little bit more in questions like this week. The red words are also ACT-aligned vocabulary terms. And those help you build that vocab. That'll make it a little bit easier to deal with the English part of the ACT. All right, so our Gatsby Chapter 4 questions. I've gone ahead and color-coded these to discuss a little bit of what I'm trying to do here as a teacher. The yellow questions are kind of mid-range, are you paying attention questions. The green questions are very basic. And the blue questions are those development and character questions that are directly aligned to the ACT goals of character development. So there's 3 character development questions in here. There's 4 green questions, which are a bit on the easy side, and then there's 3 of those yellow questions, which are a little bit more digging a little bit deeper. All right, those 2 assignments are due this week, and that is your Gatsby Chapter 4 questions and your essay outline, which we've been working on for about a week and a half. So the only assignment that is new this week is Gatsby Chapter 4. The essay outline we've been working on for about a week now. All right, I do have an informational lesson for you today. This is on detecting bias in your news source, and it will go into our recorded readings. So as we're entering into election season and as we're coming up on probably one of the more contentious presidential elections in your lifetime, or in any of our lifetimes, it's important to think a little bit about where we're getting our information from, where we're getting our news from, and how that colors our experience of the world. So what is bias and why should I care? Media bias, in the green, it's an important term, is the bias or perceived bias of journalists and news producers within mass media in the selection of many events and stories that are reported and how they're covered. So it's not just in how we cover the stories, it's not just in the way we talk about our stories, but it's in which stories we choose to cover, or we choose to avoid covering. The term media bias implies a pervasive or widespread bias contravening the standards of journalism. That's a great word, contravening. Basically, the term media bias implies non-journalistic integrity, or doing journalism that isn't moral or ethical, rather than the perspective of an individual journalist or article. The direction and degree of media bias in various countries is widely disputed. So that's in yellow because that's kind of the discussion today. The degree of bias and the direction of bias. Is it left-wing bias? Is it right-wing bias? Is it pure centrist news reporting that has no adjectives whatsoever and reads like bland toast and has no flavor? Basically, we're going to look at how to detect some bias. There's some different kinds of bias in writing. So what is bias and why should I care? So there are practical limitations on media neutrality. So there are limits to how neutral you can be and still report a story. So you can't be purely neutral. So whenever someone says, oh, this is a neutral media source, look at them a little bit skeptically, because pure neutrality in reporting is very difficult. So journalists struggle to report all available stories and facts, and the requirement that selected facts need to be linked into a coherent narrative. Basically, journalists have to tell a story no matter what they're writing, because they have to keep your interest. So not all news stories are stories or narratives, but journalists have to turn them into narratives and stories. So you can't make a story that's purely neutral without it being super boring. So if what you're reading is interesting, there's probably some bias. That's not good or bad, that's just how writing works. Also, government influence, including overt and covert censorship, biases media in some countries. For example, China, North Korea, and Myanmar specifically have government programs that control the flow of media and information. And then the last one is more important for us as Americans. Market forces that result in a biased presentation include the ownership of the news source, who owns the news outlet, concentration of media ownership, who owns all the ads on the news outlet, and how do those advertisers influence the news, the subjective selection of staff, who's working as journalists for that news outlets, and what are their experiences, what are their lived experiences, or the preferences of an intended audience. What does the audience want to hear? So what the audience wants to hear can actually drive what the news is too, because if the news reports facts that the audience doesn't agree with enough, they'll go somewhere else for their news. All right, so what? I'm not about to listen to insert other news source here. So there isn't a lot of good info on this, but it's something that I get a lot out of. So today the internet's really polarized into echo chambers. So polarized means like the poles, north and south poles, and they're as far apart from each other as you can get, right? So we have these echo chambers that are either created by social media algorithms for you or created by you as a user when you add and remove friends based on their beliefs. So here's a suggestion, and I'm going to get back into the lesson, but I suggest that you intentionally pop your social media bubble now and then and seek out competing echo chambers to hear what their rhetoric sounds like. So the odds of being swayed to the other side are low, and you'll learn a lot about the values of the group to aid in arguing and discussing with them IRL. So I recommend going to a space where you know you're going to disagree with those beliefs, not because I want you to change your beliefs, but because I think that whenever you interact with someone who disagrees with you at a really basic level, you learn about a lot about the language that is foundational to their beliefs. Part of what we're doing right now with Baldwin and Buckley is they are very much at the two poles of American discourse. So I think that it's valuable for us to do a little bit on our own what we're doing in class when we look at polarized language. All right, so how to detect bias in news media. So media have tremendous power in setting cultural guidelines and in shaping political discourse. It's essential that news media, along with other institutions, are challenged to be fair and accurate. The first step to challenging biased news is documenting the bias. So here are some questions to ask yourself about newspaper, TV, and radio. Who are the sources of this news story? So be aware of the political perspective of the sources used in a story. Media usually rely heavily on official, like government, corporate, and establishment think tank sources. Note who the experts are and which colleges they are researching for. That requires a little bit of digging on your part as a consumer. What level of degree do they have? Are they a doctor? Do they have a bachelor's degree? Do they have a master's degree? What is that degree in? Is it in what they're talking about? When is someone considered an expert by that news agency and for what topics? Note when an opinion is being presented as a fact. Phrases that can't be substantiated or proven are dead giveaways that you're consuming opinions, not news. So when someone makes a claim that can't be proven or disproven, that's an opinion, not a fact. All right, so one other thing to be aware of is reader bias. So when that's us, that's the bias that we carry as readers. So whenever you read a news story, you as the reader apply your own set of biases, and understanding those biases is important because it can color how you consume media. So there are two types of reader bias: implicit bias. So implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. It's tricky because it's subconscious. It's our foundational, like it's the basement of your mental house. You don't go down there all the time. The house rests on it. It's probably not the part of your house that you hang out in most of the time, but it's foundational and the rest of the house would fall down without it. You can profess to believe one thing, but in actuality you do say or gravitate towards something else. It's worth noting that implicit bias in news is about political bias rather than racial bias, but the term implicit bias is an important part of the discussion of racism in American history and law. A good example of people discussing implicit bias is this comic we have over here. The first guy says, the conversation is not about implied bias, it should be about racism. And then the lady responds, which prompts the usual denial about institutional racism. And then the last dude says, so we should talk about implicit denial. So implicit bias is this kind of wobbly concept that is being discussed and explored right now, and in a lot of different directions. And it basically stems from the psychological concept that you have a subconscious in your brain that your conscious mind sits on top of, and the subconscious is like the bottom of the iceberg, and your conscious mind is this little bit that floats on top and you're actually aware of, but your subconscious is made up of all your experiences and biases that you aren't aware of carrying. The other kind of readership bias is confirmation bias, and this one is so common, and like I can see this one in my own life a lot. Whenever I go and I find information while researching, I'm like, oh well, this makes me feel comfortable, and this is what I was looking for, so this must be true. So confirmation bias is the tendency of people to favor information that confirms their beliefs or hypotheses and minimizes evidence to the contrary. The person in the cartoon is a hyperbolic example of this, but often this is exactly what student researchers do. So you have this guy over here, he says, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the real truth. And then he Googles his hotly debated topic, and his first link is literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe. And he says, jackpot, I found it. I found the perfect source. So while that may fly in some high school courses when it comes to researching, that won't fly in college. They only search for information that agrees with them, defends their beliefs, or affirms their preconceived notions. This is an easy bias to fall prey to while researching for academic papers, because you want ammunition. You want good ammo for writing a paper that supports your argument. But you need to remember that you shouldn't just seek out information that agrees with you if you're writing a real research paper. You need to find information that disagrees with you too. Think of it this way. How can you argue for something if you don't know what your opponents are going to say? You're just making statements. You don't know if they have really good arguments against your points. And if they have really good arguments against your points, you either need to deal with those really good counterarguments or avoid them or work around them. But if they have really good counterarguments, then you will lose in a straight up debate. So it's important to be able to deal with your opponents. We talk about claims and counterclaims a lot in English whenever we're talking about that stuff. All right, so this is a busy slide, but I think that this is a really valuable slide. So here's a way to think about bias on news sources visually. All right, so if you look on the right side of the screen, these are a ton of news sources that this all sides media bias chart has put together. Now, you need to take that with a grain of salt, because the people who put this together probably also have some bias. I think this is the best version of these that I found, and it's the most up-to-date version of these that I found. So this is the majority of news sources right now that you can get that aren't literally fake news that you can be reading online. So you have, to kind of break it down, all of the ones in the first column are left-leaning or liberal. All the ones in the last column are right-leaning or conservative. All the ones in the center column are pure news and tend to be a little bit boring, because there's no flavoring added, there's no team added to it, and all the ones in these columns to the side lean left or right. So these lean left and these lean right. Sorry about the yodeling babies. So what I suggest you do is grab one source of news from each column and read the top stories once a week. Here's why. So if you consume these diverse political viewpoints, you're going to become better at defending your own views, because you already know what your political opponents are going to say. If they only consume one or two sources in their comfort zone, you're going to have a huge leg up on them in discussions and debates, because they're only getting one news source. And if you're reading their news source plus other news sources, then you'll not only know their arguments, but you'll know the counter arguments out there. So if you think of them like food groups, it makes it a little bit easier. You want to limit your intake of the far left or the far right. You can have as much of the center as you want, because it's low in bias. Not without bias, but low in bias. So like for me personally, I usually read the AP and I read NPR News. And then when I want to get my like moderate bias, I read New York Times and Fox News online news only, not opinion. And then when I want my extreme bias, I usually read Democracy Now! Or Breitbart. Democracy Now! Is straight up like very far left and Breitbart is very far right. Like they do not get along conceptually at all. But it's really fun. I don't know if this is fun for me alone or for anybody else out there, but I get a lot of joy from reading Democracy Now! And Breitbart immediately after each other because it's almost like reading news from two completely different realities. Okay. Whew. Just a quick reminder before I close out, and this is a quick lesson, but I think it's a valuable lesson going into a really contentious debate season and voting season. So if you only go to one source for news, your views aren't your views. Your views are the views of the media that you consume. So if you know what you're consuming, you're going to be harder to manipulate with targeted messaging. And this has never been more real during this election season. And one last thing, if your primary news sources are social media shares, like Twitter or Facebook, Insta, Reddit, etc., you got to be doubly aware that you're curating your own echo chambers. What I mean is the way that you interact with that social media is creating the reality that you perceive through that social media. For example, so for Twitter, the algorithm is curating your echo chamber. So you can't really see the echo chamber, but in the suggested people for you to follow and in the feed that it gives you, the algorithm is specifically feeding you information, news, and views that it knows you're more likely to interact with. That can be positive or negative interactions. So it's feeding you stuff that's either going to make you angry or happy or sad, depending on what you have interacted with in the past. So Twitter has a hidden echo chamber. Facebook is a self-curated echo chamber where made of people that you've followed or people that you've friended. Insta is an algorithm self-curated, so it's also kind of hidden like Twitter. And then on Reddit, you're self-curating your echo chambers because you're choosing which subreddits to follow. Now, Reddit is probably the least, or Reddit is probably the most clear when it comes to echo chambers because they're literally titled, and you can like go to r/left-wing discussion or r/conservative discussion, and they're actually labeled conservative or left-wing. But a lot of the echo chambers are not titled like that. So sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not. Anyways, if you're getting your news primarily from social media, just be aware that you're kind of curating your own echo chambers, and it's a little bit better to go directly to the source for news. All right. I hope that was interesting. There's no lesson attached to that. The only lessons we have this week are Gatsby and the outline. We're still aimed firmly at passing that ACT reading by doing good practice in reading at-level texts through Gatsby and responding to those at-level texts through our own writing. And we're still aimed at getting dual credit for this JCTC course by completing the 4 big essays. The first one being the This I Believe essay, due on the 31st this month. Your outline is due Saturday. Thank you for listening. I hope you guys have a great afternoon and a great weekend. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me through the email on that link on the All Recordings Assignments and Lesson link. I have an email in there. You can also reach out to me through Google Classroom. I hope to see you guys in class. Have a good one. Bye.